So Carnage is one of the best stories Marvel has going right now. Check this out. So what this does here is this initially picks up with a kid by the name of Scott, and it basically takes place at what's called St. Estes Orphanage. Now, this kind of just jumps away from the Carnage story as we've covered it right now. We actually leave the symbiote behind, but we encounter something cool. What is in effect the god of gods when it comes to the symbiotes that are out there, and it's gonna be the least likely person that you expect. So what ends up happening here is that when Scott gets to St. Estes Orphanage, there's a kind of like a history, or I guess maybe a series of myths and legends that surround this house, right? It's just your haunted house. Now, some of these are true and some of these are not, but the nature of the myths are things that have just kind of grown in the telling over the years as people have visited this place for the purpose of thrills, to like spend the night there, that kind of a thing. So it's like Waverly Sanatorium out in Louisville, Kentucky, right? If you can spend the night, there's some kind of cosmic prize for you at the end of all things. But what's nuts here is Scott's kind of like live streaming this whole thing, intending to go into the house and to check it out. Now, on the outside, this house is about as derelict as it gets. It's falling apart, windows are broken, all that kind of stuff, because no one's lived in St. Estes for years, right? No one's been here for years and years and years. But as soon as he gets inside, the house is immediately sorted out, right? The house is immediately just clean and pristine. Now, what's nuts here is that as he's talking to his fans, writing starts to appear on the wall, and it says, time to put some skin in the game, right? And then like a scalpel appears on the floor. Now, I'm gonna be honest with you guys, if this were me, I would be like, nope, and I'd leave. When writing starts appearing on the wall on its own, that's when it's time to go. If I even decided to do something crazy like this in the first place. But Scott does it, right? It's all for the fans, it's all for the thrills, that kind of a thing. Now, once he does that, he gets into like the next room, and there's just a guy who's like eating a face, right? And it just says like, feed the man some face to eat, Scott Rawson. So now the house is aware of who he is. Of course, the scalpel's handed to him, and Scott cuts a portion of his face and then feeds it to the guy. When he gets into the third room, this disembodied voice kind of comes out of nowhere and says, let's turn this off. And we end up finding out it's Cletus Kasady. Now, here's the thing, right? So a lot of people are probably, if you've been following the Carnage story up to this point, you're probably kind of like, I thought Cletus was in the mind of John. Yes, that is a facsimile of Cletus. So let's kind of bring everything into order and let's make sense of it all. So those of you guys who remember our story, The King in Black, when Knull the symbiote god showed up on Earth and took control of all the symbiotes and all that kind of stuff, there was a story that we covered that took place after it that was called Extreme Carnage, right? It was a two-part story that we did. Really, it was 8 parts, but we split it into 2. You'll find a link to it. It'll be in the Carnage playlist. You'll find a link to it down in the comments. The idea behind this is that during King in Black, that Iron Man had actually taken one of the symbiotes that was controlled by Knull and then made it his own. So in effect, Iron Man became a symbiote. This is what was called the Extrembiote, is really the phrase given to it. It was an extreme symbiote, just given the level of power that it had. What ended up happening here is Cletus Cassidy, who was already bonded to the Carnage symbiote, reached out to the Extreme symbiote and then bonded with it. Now, of course, one of the things that sort of took place in between the Extreme Carnage story and this, which is actually explained later on in the Carnage comics, which of course we'll get to, that there was basically a falling out, that the Carnage symbiote was expelled from Cletus Cassidy and the Extreme symbiote, and that's why the Carnage symbiote's doing everything that it's doing right now. But the Extreme symbiote has an immense level of power because it was basically one of the symbiote dragons, right? Crafted specifically by Knull. Its power dwarfs virtually all other symbiotes that are out there. And that's what's gonna be so crazy about this. Because when Cletus Cassidy starts talking to Scott, what he starts doing is saying things like, you came here to my house and you would have left like all the others the moment I asked for another piece of flesh, but it was the robe. You want to know how, don't you? What he's referring to is that when Scott got into the second room and the man was sitting there eating a face, it was wearing the robe of his father, right? Scott's father. And his mind was like, how in the world did they know that my father used to wear that robe? Now, the other part of what's going on here with Cletus is that this is the actual physical form of Cletus Kasady, which begs the question, what's going on with John Shade? Okay, one of the things that was recently established in Marvel Comics is that whenever a symbiote bonds to a host, it leaves behind what's called a codex, basically a piece of itself. What Ram V seems to be doing here is he's saying that not only does the symbiote leave a piece of itself in the host leaves a piece of itself in the symbiote. So the best way to think about the nature of a codex or codices is to actually look at Harry Potter, right? Voldemort. Horcruxes. Voldemort could put a portion of his soul inside of an object. That's how codices work, right? A portion of their essence, of their being. Now, if that really is what's going on, that the voice in the head of John Shade is the codex of Cletus Cassidy, it's a whole new ballgame now, right? I'm speculating here because we don't know for certain that's what's happening, but it's just kind of my thought process on that. But the important thing here is that this is the actual Cletus Cassidy in his physical form. But the important thing here is that as he talks to Scott, where Scott kind of asks him like, who are you? What's your deal? One of the things to know is he's talking to one of the most dangerous people in the entirety of the history of Marvel Comics. Scott doesn't know it, right? But Cletus Cassidy's insane. He's like Marvel's version of the Joker, basically. He's insane, he's crazy, he's an answer to the question, what if the Joker became Venom? That's really what he was designed to be when he was originally introduced. But he plays it very coy and very cavalier. He says, oh, I'm just an orphan boy who grew up here in St. Estes, where the shadows that roamed the halls were so painfully boring that I made up worse devils inside my own head. I've been to so many places since. I have seen beyond these worlds. And he says, I've been tethered and bonded and stitched in with things far beyond understanding. Specifically, he's talking about Knull, the symbiote god. And he says, but I keep returning to this house over and over. I wonder if this was my first symbiosis. Do you understand, Scott? When I returned, reborn in new skin, in new armor, I melded in this place. I am this house, and the house is me. Now, what he's referring to when he says that is that at the end of Extreme Carnage, when Cletus Cassidy was officially bonded with the Extreme Symbiote, he came back here and actually bonded with the physical house itself. So when he says, I'm this house and this house is me, he's saying it literally. It's not one of those things where it's like, it's such an important part of my history that, it's very important to me. No. He physically is part of this house. He is the house, right? Like, that's literally what's going on here. It's how the writing appeared on the wall. It's why Scott saw the man who was eating the face. They're all manifestations of what Cletus Cassidy is creating. He's effectively altering reality in a localized space. It's kind of nuts, right? And so Cletus says, or at least he asks, you wondered how I knew about the robe. In the first room, the piece of skin that you gave, the house took it, and I used it to look inside you and to find out who you are. I know you try hard to be interesting and charming. It's why you sneak into houses at night armed with a phone. You want to know that behind some door is a thing that is beyond the mundane. But St. Estes showed me that the real door that needs to be opened is inside of you. So tell me, Scott, do you want to open the door to the next room? And that is a very important question that Cletus is asking here, because what he is in effect telling Scott is, if you open this door, there's no going back. There's no unringing this bell. If you step through, you will never be the person that you were before. There's no coming back from that. And Scott ultimately says yes. Now, what's so cool about this is that as he enters into this room that's just kind of filled with Penrose steps, is all these different aspects of like Scott's own life that he's really being confronted with. And one of the first things he's really confronted with here are quote unquote the noises that came from his father's room upstairs, right? Whenever it is that his mother was away. The idea of him being basically beaten and bullied when he was a kid, different things along those lines, these things that have happened over the course of his life that irrevocably changed him on a personal level. And what Cletus says is the house is endless within, Scott, as endless as you or I are on the interior. The only question is, how many pieces do you have to give? Now, the beauty about this and what Cletus is saying is the house will change according to you. Every room you enter will be a different part of yourself, but the things that you've experienced and how you interpret those experiences are endless because you're experiencing these things as you're here. So sure, there's the sound coming from your dad's room upstairs when your mom was away. You interpreted that a certain way. The house will show you that, but now you're interpreting that interpretation a different way, and the house will show you that too, right? It is literally a manifestation of you, and it will stretch on forever. But where Scott looks at this is almost a kind of nonsensical thing, some ploy, some ruse, right? Something along those lines. Cletus dismisses it, right? And is like, no, right? Do not do that. And if you truly believe it is, then here's the exit. Leave, right? Walk away if you even think you can. Now, what's really cool about this, right? What's really important about this is that it's almost kind of toying with this idea that Scott sort of passed across a kind of threshold, that there is actually no way to escape here. More so than that, what Cletus says is, these things that I've shown you are how you remember them. But just because you remember things being a certain way does not mean they were that way. And he says, outside, you're just a boy who discovered his father cheated on his mom every night that she was away. Outside, Scott Rawson only grew up to be another cliche who bullied others because they reminded him of who he used to be. You're the bad guy and the victim, Scott. That's what you are. You remember being bullied. You were the one doing the bullying. That's who you are. And he says, outside, you try so hard to be the hero of your own stories, but the truth is not romantic except by chance. And the truth is that you are small, boring, and unimportant. And where Scott asks, is any of this real? The response of Cletus is, life claws away pieces of who you are until you're too old to notice and then you die. Here, I took pieces of you to show you a different truth. Tell me, Scott Rawson, which felt more real? And that's what's so interesting here, is because he's kind of alluring him, right? Do you want to become part of the house? There's the truth that exists out there, but I've taken everything that you know and everything that you believe, and I've shown you the world as it really existed, along with a bit of recreation of my own making. Which is more alluring to you? And the response of Scott is, you said you keep returning to this house, but you said you've been outside and far beyond. You found nothing in all existence that could keep you there. And the response of Cletus is, I found someone once, we were inseparable, we were almost a god, of course referring to Carnage. And he kind of runs over the events that transpired after after Extreme Carnage, which we don't really get super in-depth in here, which is that there was quote unquote a falling out, if you want to call it that, between Carnage and Cletus Cassidy, and Carnage was expelled. And of course, again, Carnage is currently on his quest right now. But what he also says here, and this is what's so interesting, is he says Carnage is on his own mission out there to try to attain godhood. But what he's going to find is that his desire to achieve this life out there, it will not come to fruition. It will not be what he believes it to be. That he's going to see the faults in the stars, and when that happens, he's going to end up coming back home. It's inevitable, because I've seen the way things truly are. And he says this by saying, it can change you. That kind of power, that kind of perspective, they went away from me to see how far they could go. Sometimes I wonder what carnage they must be getting up to, but then I realize they will see the truth that I saw when it all comes full circle. The twinkles in the sky are only the ghosts of dead stars, and there's nowhere in all of existence that is more beautiful or more real than my interior, than inside this house. Here, right here, still, as I craft a reality of my own making, I can choose to be God. And he kills Scott Rawson. I gotta tell you guys, this is probably one of the absolute best depictions of Cletus Cassidy that I have ever seen in the history of comics, because literally Scott Rawson stepped into the mind of a serial killer and died while he was there. It was amazing. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section, right? I loved this. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.